Hey everyone, Howie Fisher with Fisher's Flies. Thanks for checking in. This is episode 9 in my Fulling Mill 2025 catalog series, and this is the Red Stripe Diver, named for the red stripe of deer hair on the head. This is an awesome deer head diver streamer pattern from Fulling Mill. For the back hook on this fly, I'm using a streamer stripper Fulling Mill 6040 in size 4. And for the thread to start, I'm using UTC 140 denier in brown. This is both a pretty complex and easy fly all at the same time. So it's complex in the sense that it is time consuming and involved, if you will. It also has the deer head hair, which is a little bit more of a difficult technique. However, the majority of the fly is the same 3 steps repeated, or 2 steps. For the tail, I'm using Strung saddle from Nature's Spirit in dark olive. To get started on this fly, I'm going to grab 2 feathers, and I want them to be similar in shape and length. And I'm going to measure these about 2 times the length of the hook shank. And I'm just going to come in on either side and secure these with a couple wraps. And before I get too far, I just want to make sure that they're where I want them to be. If you use the whole feather on this step, it makes securing these flies or these feathers much easier. If you preen back all the rest of the fibers and pull them off, it makes the feathers a little bit more slippery. For the body, I'm using Super Pearl Flash from Fulling Mill. This is a corded or chenille style flash. I'm using olive brown. This is single-sided, so it makes wrapping a fly like this super easy. Pretty straightforward. Once I tie it in, I'm going to bring my thread pretty much to right behind the hook eye. And I'm just going to then wrap this forward. And I like to take open wraps, not touching wraps. This stuff can build up or pack up pretty quickly. And so on a fly like this, I like to use open wraps. You can see I'm not making these touching or even overlapping to spread out that flash, but still fill the body of this fly. I'm going to leave myself a little bit of space right behind the hook eye and tie this off, leaving probably about an eye length gap. Then I'm going to just clean this up for the next step, creating a space that's probably about 2 eye lengths. The next material on this fly is going to be the new Salty Craft Fur from Fulling Mill, and here I'm using dark brown. This stuff is super quality. The price can't be beat. For $10, you get a massive piece of craft fur. So if you use craft fur a lot or want to start using it, I'd highly recommend checking out the new Fulling Mill Salty Flash Fiber. And just because it's called salty doesn't mean it's only for saltwater flies. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to process this pretty much like deer hair or other hair. I'm going to take a chunk off and pull out the short fibers and the super long fibers. Especially for this tail section, I want to have a decent enough amount of fibers without them being too long, but also create a bit of a natural taper. And so on this tail section specifically, I'm going to pull out a little bit more of the longer fibers to make sure that I still have a decent amount of bulk. And so once I've got that where I want it, I'm going to clip off all of the excess and I'm going to reverse tie this in. So what that means is I'm going to put my butt ends facing backwards like so, take a couple wraps over the fibers, 2 or 3 looser wraps, and then make sure that everything is where you want it to be. Now's the chance to kind of move those fibers around if you need. And then I'm just going to take this and push all these fibers back. If you have a tool, the tool that I just used is called the John or Proto John. It's a tool. A decent amount of fly shops I've seen carry it, but you can also use an old pen cap. There's some other tools on the market that you can use as well, but just something to help you push these fibers back. You don't even need to use a tool. If you don't want to, you can just use your fingers. But once I've got it where I want it, I'm going to go ahead and just whip finish and snip my thread off. And to make sure that those fibers or that thread doesn't go anywhere, I'm just going to coat this with a quick coat of Solar Bone Dry. Make sure that that stays secure. And this is where this fly is honestly really easy because, like I said, it's really just 2 or 3 steps. Technically 2, I guess. 2 steps just repeated for the 4 parts of the fly. So this fly has the rear hook, 2 shanks in the middle, 2 15mm shanks. Here I'm using spawn fly fishing shanks, and then the main hook. And so on the rear hook and the 2 middle shanks, I'm just repeating the process of the flash and the craft fur. And then I'm going to repeat that too for the first part of the main hook in the front of this fly. So again, I'm using a 15mm articulation shank from Spawn Fly Fishing, and then I'm going to take my 140 denier thread and get started on the hook shank again. And what I'm going to do here, and what's important, is with these articulation shanks, you want to build up some thread specifically on the back portion of the hook shank. And what that's going to do is it's actually going to keep the fly from fouling on itself, especially with this rear hook here. It's not going to guarantee it, but the further back that you take it, the more or the less likely it is going to be to foul. Another thing that's going to help this fly prevent from fouling on itself is using this flash that will actually just keep the rest of the body behind the section kind of in place. Once I add my flash in again and wrap it forward, I'm then going to secure it again and clean it up for the head section. Again, I'm going to grab a decent chunk of this salty craft fur, and with each section I like to just add a little bit more of this craft fur. So again, I'm kind of starting to create a natural taper on this fly just with the amount of craft fur that I'm using. Again, I'm going to process this like deer or elk hair. I'm going to brush out the short fibers either with my fingers or a comb and take out some of the longer fibers as well. When measuring these next sections for the craft fur, I like to have these craft fur sections overlapping, not necessarily end to end, but just overlapping. So again, just helping this fly to create a little bit of a taper on itself, especially as it builds and swims. I'm going to repeat the same process. So I'm going to reverse tie this in, take a couple wraps, make sure all the fibers are spread out evenly. They're not in this case, so I'm going to just force them kind of to go around the hook shank. And they don't need to be perfect. As you can see here, I'm forcing them around the hook shank, and they'll essentially fall into place. Another nice part about this fly is that even if it doesn't look perfect, you don't get those fibers wrapped around perfectly or in the position that you want them in. You can come back in afterwards, like I just did there with my thread, and clean it up. But then also too, a lot of this is going to get hidden, and it's kind of going to balance itself out as you continue to build this fly. So if the head isn't perfect or the fold back isn't perfect, don't fret too much about it. It's kind of going to all blend together. It'll kind of clean itself up, cover itself up as you continue to build this fly. You want it to be relatively close to where you want it, but again, if it's not perfect, I would say don't worry too much about it. So I'm going to add another one of these 15mm Spawn fly fishing shanks here, and then I'm just going to repeat the process. And I'm going to speed this portion up so you don't have to listen to me jabber. So I did actually get the chance to take this fly for a test ride the other day, and to no surprise, it swims and fishes amazingly. I didn't catch any fish on it. I did have one hit on it, but it swims and moves very similarly to a game changer, again with no surprise with this multiple articulation of this fly. So once I finish this process up, I'm then going to remove this entire fly from the vise, and we're going to attach it all to the leading or main hook, which is going to be a larger hook here. And for that hook, this is going to be another streamer stripper hook from Fulling Mill, the Fulling Mill 6050, and the rear hook for reference, sorry, 6040. The rear hook for reference was a size 4. This leading hook is going to be a size 2. So once I get that in the vise, I'm going to grab some wire, trailer wire here. I'm using Wirebite, which is 30-pound knottable wire from Rio. You can use Senya's trailer wire, or beadlawn is what Kelly Gallup likes to use, which is craft store wire, or anything similar, as long as it holds. This fly is designed to fish for larger fish, so just make sure you're using something that is going to hold up to the fish you're targeting with it. So I'm going to get started with my 140 denier thread, again in brown, on the hook shank, and I'm just going to lay down a good thread base. You want to make sure that you give your wire something to essentially grip onto. So it doesn't have to be perfect. As you can see here, I'm just going at it a little bit haphazardly. But I'm going to take that wire, I pre-cut mine to a couple inches, especially when production tying. I personally like to line up the ends and then essentially crease that wire just to make sure that it's not going to go anywhere. If you don't do this, you can end up with an awkward loop, so on and so forth, and it can kind of mess up the way that it swims. So once I get it where I want it, I'm then going to pull it onto the hook shank. I'm going to take about 4 or 5 wraps to make sure it's not going to go anywhere, but loose enough to where I can adjust it if I need to, which I did here. I'm then going to take some really large open spiral wraps forward and then come a little bit backwards, double over my wire here. And this is an important step. You want to make sure that that wire, especially on this type of fly with a rear hook, isn't going anywhere if you hook into a big fish. Once I've got that, I'm going to clip off this wire. I like to leave some space. So again, I'm taking very large open wraps to allow to take some brush on super glue. Here I'm using Zap-A-Gap, and just make sure that I'm getting a lot of contact with that actual wire. And this is really how I tie on any articulated streamer when I'm tying in wire like this. I do it this exact same way because I know it's going to hold. I know I'm going to get some good contact with the wire and the thread and the hook shank. So here I'm just going to really take a bunch of wraps to cover that wire. You may need to soak up some super glue with some paper towels or everything similar. I didn't do that here, and I ended up getting a little bit on my fingers. So not the end of the world, but if you don't like super glue on your fingers, I would recommend maybe dabbing that off with some paper towel or just covering it a good wraps. But what I also did here is if you get it on your finger, it doesn't necessarily dry instantly. And so on this fly, I accidentally kind of mucked up some of the fibers themselves as I was preening them backwards. So, but again, just attaching the flash, same flash as the other 3 sections, wrapping it forward, open wraps again. And I'm going to take this to about the 1/2, 2/3 area of the fly. And you want to make sure that you're leaving yourself plenty of room to finish this fly with that deer hair head. So ultimately, the size of this flash section on this front hook is going to be about the same as the other 3 sections. If you wanted to be precise, I would say I probably put about 5, 6, maybe 7 wraps of flash on each section. Again, I'm just going to repeat this process with this craft fur. With this head section, I'm going to grab a pretty significantly larger or thicker chunk of craft fur. Really, again, building that taper, but this is going to be the head section, so I want this head section to push water, to hold the profile of the fly itself, and make sure that everything is covered. And again, I'm just going to clean out the short fibers, brush them out, pull them out. In this head section, you can leave a little bit of the longer fibers if you want. But again, I want this overlapping with the other three sections, and again, continuing that taper that we've been building so far. I've said it already, and I'll say it again. Really is kind of a pretty easy fly up until this point. Again, you're just tying in that flash and then this craft fur and reverse tying it. Honestly, you could probably add some sort of dubbing head here on this fly if you wanted to, and fish it, and it would probably fish pretty well. But again, reverse tying this in, making sure that it's evenly spread, looks good, and then I'm going to come in with my tool and push all the fibers back. And I tied this a little bit far forward from where I really want it, so I'm going to just use my fingers to push it back like some deer hair. And then I'm going to come in, make sure everything's evenly spread, and then tie everything down, make sure it's not going anywhere. Next, I'm going to grab some flash. Here I am using Flashabou in brown. I'm going to grab a couple fibers, really about 3 or 4, and double them over onto the thread essentially. And so in turn, I'm going to be creating 8. So if you want less flash, choose less fibers. If you want more, choose more. But these are going to go directly on top of the fly to stay on top of the fly and flash almost independently as this fly is swimming. Once I've got that where I want it, I'm going to bring my thread forward a little bit, and I'm actually going to whip finish here. So for this section, I'm going to change threads. So I'm going to get rid of my UTC 140 denier, and then I'm going to grab some Semperfli 300 denier hair stacker in white. This is a super thick thread that works really well for stacking hair. It's not going to cut through your fibers. It's also insanely strong. And so you are probably not going to break this fly or this thread. So next I'm grabbing some deer hair belly. Here I'm using dark brown from Fulling Mill. And again, similar to the rest of the fly, I'm going to grab a good chunk, clean it out, get rid of all the short fibers here on this deer belly. I've got to make sure that you get rid of all of the under fur as well, the fuzzies, get rid of any crazy long fibers. For this first section, you can stack this clump if you would like. You don't need to, but you can. But what I'm going to do is this first section is going to be the collar of the fly, so it's going to flare out, act like pectoral fins, push some water, so on and so forth. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to measure my length, and then I'm going to snip off the butt ends of the fly. And I'm going to tie this in as close as possible to that that craft fur, but then also as close as possible to the butt ends. I'm going to take 2 wraps, and then I'm going to start spinning this hair around the shank, and then kind of work my way through those butt ends just to help it secure it some more. Here I'm going to push this clump back. I want to create as much room as possible for the rest of the head. And then I'm just going to come in and I'm going to clean up these butt ends just a little bit. They don't need to be perfect, but the closer you can get them or the cleaner you can get them, the better the rest of the head is going to stack and look. And I'm really just going to make sure that this clump isn't going anywhere. Everything looks good. And then I'm going to grab another chunk of this brown deer hair. And you want this really obviously is the hardest part or most complicated part of this fly. And the trickiest part is kind of getting the ratio right. This isn't a bass bug, so ideally you don't want this fly to float, but you do want it to have enough hair to push water and to make a good enough head. And so it may take some time to really get that ratio down, and it really just takes practice. And so I'm going to grab probably, you might have heard people talk about deer hair in pencil sizes. I'm grabbing about 2, maybe 3 pencil worths here. I'm going to take one pretty loose wrap and then a little bit of a tighter wrap, and I'm going to spin this then around here while continuing to take some more wraps. And in total, I took about 4 or 5 wraps there, and then I'm going to start pushing this hair back to compact it. Again, this is the hardest part of this, other than actually spinning and stacking this deer hair, is really trying to get that ratio right. Again, you don't want too much hair on here, otherwise the head will actually float, but you want enough to build up this head and make sure that you've got it looking how you want it. So once I've got that pushed back, I'm then going to bring my thread in front of this clump. And if you have a Pat Cohen's Fugly Packer here, this might be the place to use it. But I'm also going to preen these fibers back and then kind of create a little bit of a thread dam in front of it. For me personally, and you may agree with this, the hardest part of packing deer hair is kind of making sure that those fibers stand up straight or point backwards as you're continuing to stack hair. Next, I'm grabbing this red, and then I'm going to put this on. Again, this is where the red stripe diver name comes from, is this red stripe of deer hair on the head. Again, I'm just repeating the process of this red here, and I'm going to clean out the short fibers and any of the long fibers as well. There's some great people out there who, if you want to get better at your deer hair, I recommend checking them out. Pat Cohen's obviously one of them. Joe Jackson, who goes by the name Sergeant Bass Fisher, is a deer hair wizard. There's others as well. Phil Rowley is another deer hair master, as well as Gunnar Brammer. All of those guys, I believe, have YouTube channels and are phenomenal. So for this red stripe, I'm going to make sure that I take 2 looser wraps, but firm enough to hold it in place. And then I'm just going to work this around and make sure that it's covering the full amount. This is actually something that I learned from Gunnar Brammer. And so when doing it that way, making sure that the hair covers the full around the shank, that's how you prevent ending up with deer hair sticking to one side or spinning unevenly, so on and so forth. And so again, you take 2 loose wraps, spread the hair around the hook shank if you need to, and then take a 3rd wrap and cinch and spin. I'm going to just repeat the same process and pull my hair back and kind of create a little bit of a thread dam in front of that stack before moving forward. And I'm just going to push this hair back a little bit again, just to give myself enough space to finish this fly. So on this fly specifically, I'm packing this deer hair to give myself enough space for the next section. I'm not necessarily packing for tightness like you would on a deer hair bug, a bass bug, where you want it to float to try and get more material in. I'm really just packing this to allow myself a little bit more room to finish this fly off. So again, this is the final section. I'm going to prep my hair the same exact way, taking out the short fibers, and I'm switching back to the brown on this section. So it's going to go brown, red, brown. And I'm just going to repeat that same process of spinning this deer hair. Unfortunately, my camera stopped recording at this point for some point, so you'll see the beginning of this process, and you'll just have to trust that I repeated the same process. So again, camera turned off, but here you have it. This is the finished product. I've already whip finished on this as well. And now comes the trimming part. Although this may seem easy, this can be one of the most difficult portions because it's super easy to mess up the entire fly that you just spent so much time working on. So less is always more. I like to start with an angled cut on the top and go way less than you think you want to finish at. You can always trim off more, but you can never put it back. And it's super easy to mess this fly up with one cut. On the bottom, I'm going to do pretty much a straight cut back underneath the hook. This is allowing for the hook or the hook point to have a little bit extra room. But with that flat cut on the bottom, you're also helping the fly to perform the way it's supposed to, which is you want that angle on top so that when you strip it, it's going to dive down. Next, I personally like to come in with some scissors once I've got a rough shape and then just start to kind of clean it up. Here I'm using some Renamid extra long blade scissors. These are great for this type of stuff if you are not familiar with them. Throughout this whole process of trimming, you want to make sure that you're holding back that collar that you worked so nicely on getting in there. So the fibers, the deer fibers that are all the way in the back of this head, the collar that we tied on first, that first clump, kind of want to hold it down, make sure you don't cut those off because, again, we want that to kind of really start creating that head and push water, but also kind of gap that transition between the head and the body of the fly. So it's multi-purpose, but again, you want to make sure that you protect that collar that you've built. So again, I'm going to speed this process up because it's really just trimming and most of it's off of camera. So this is on this fly is really a traditional SID or diver style head. You kind of want to make sure that you have a good angle on the top of the fly and the head itself so that when you strip it, it dives down. But that deer hair is going to make it buoyant neutral so that it kind of comes back towards the surface. You can really get super in depth on this process, this trimming process, but don't get too carried away. Once I've got it trimmed and where I like it, I'm actually going to grab a cautery tool. This step is probably extra. You can get away without doing this. I like to do it to give my eyes a nice base to sit on. You can also do it by heating up a bodkin. That's a little bit rougher, but it can work. But again, I'm going to just clear some spots for the eyes that are coming. I'm then going to use some Solares Bone Flex Dry. I really like using this stuff because it's similar to the Bone Dry, which is super thin, so it's going to seep into this head and make it a little bit more durable, but it's also going to give those eyes, again, a nice spot to essentially sit on, make sure they're not going to go anywhere, they're not going to compress the deer hair too much, so on and so forth. So once I've got that in place and cured, I'm then going to continue to coat the rest of this and just make sure I've got it coated. Again, you can skip that step specifically if you'd like, but it helps to create more durable flies, especially if you're fishing for fish that have teeth. But once I've done that, I'm then going to grab my eyes. Here on this fly, I'm using Epoxy eyes in fluorescent red 5mm from Fulling Mill. This is one of their new products again. This fly specifically calls for red eyes. If you have other red eyes, obviously feel free to use them. So now that I've created that landing spot essentially for these eyes, I'm going to put a little bit of super glue on there and then stick my eye in place. And you can see even with that resin, this head is still a little bit flexible. So I just want to put these where I want them to be. I'm then going to repeat the process on the other side. Put a little dab of super glue on that landing spot that I created. And then stick my eye right on top. And then pretty much lastly, I'm going to grab my resin again, my Solarez Bone Flex Dry, and cover these eyes. This is going to add durability again and make sure that give these eyes less of a chance of popping off if you land a big fish or two. And again, it's not going to make it indestructible, but it's going to give them the chance to last a lot longer if you do this step. Once I've added both these eyes on, I'll cure it. And here you have it. This is the red stripe diver. If you stuck along with me this long, thanks so much. Tie them up, fish them, let me know what you think. Thanks for checking in.